The interpreter isn't coming? Then what about the $10 million deal?
Kimberly, the innkeeper, cried out in despair.
Nestled deep in the mountains, Clementine Inn is a warm and inviting hot spring inn that has been lovingly passed down through generations. However, the tides of time have steadily reduced its stream of guests year after year, and bankruptcy is becoming a very real possibility. Just as things were looking grim, a chance for revival came in the form of a $10 million investment proposal from an overseas VIP. But on the crucial day of negotiations, the interpreter failed to show up. And the investor was already on their way. In the reception hall, the silence was thick with tension and despair. Every time someone tried to speak, it felt as if the future crumbled a little more. If we lose this deal, it's over for us. Kimberly slumped forward as though her strings had been cut, her voice heavy with defeat. The staff around her wore expressions that said the same thing: it's over. If the inn were to go under, the employees would lose their jobs, and centuries of tradition would vanish in an instant. Then I'll do it. I'll be the interpreter.
My voice cut through the oppressive atmosphere like a blade. The staff turned to look at me in shock.
But no one took me seriously.
To them, I was just the driver.
What? You? A mere driver interpreting?
That's ridiculous. Just go back to polishing the car.
One of the inn's employees sneered, their words laced with mockery. The atmosphere around us echoed their sentiment: yeah, that's impossible.
But when the overseas VIP caught sight of me, their expression was one of utter astonishment. Why are you here, of all places? It was no surprise.
Being a driver was just a front. My true identity was: my name is Kyle.
In my mid-30s, I work as the dedicated driver for Clementine Inn, a long-standing hot spring inn tucked away quietly in the mountains.
It may sound unremarkable, but there's a unique sense of fulfillment in this job. Driving along misty mountain roads in the quiet of the morning. The relief of safely delivering exhausted guests back to the inn at night. The scenery visible from the driver's seat and the vibrations of the car that travel through my hands as I grip the steering wheel. Each of these details gives me a sense of fulfillment in my work. This inn welcomes a variety of guests every day. Families, couples, and solo travelers on a whim. Many of them are elderly, so I always hold the wheel with the utmost care, ensuring that my driving never gives them a reason to feel uneasy. Every time I safely drop off or pick up a guest, Kimberly, the innkeeper, thanks me with a warm thank you as always. And it never fails to make my heart feel a little warmer. Clementine Inn is known for its old wooden architecture and its charming open-air baths. To me, this place holds an irreplaceable warmth and a nostalgic glimpse of Japan's original landscape. Working here, even as a driver, is more than enough for me. Right now, I cherish a life where I can feel the genuine value of my work, rather than worrying about appearances or titles. That said, I've been hearing more and more feedback lately from elderly guests about how difficult it is to reach the inn from the station. As someone who drives guests back and forth every day, I've seen firsthand how many people struggle with transportation. I began to wonder if there was a way to make it easier for people to come here while also highlighting the inn's unique charm. With that thought in mind, I casually suggested an idea to Kimberly a few days ago. Kimberly,
how about considering something like a free weekday shuttle bus or a day trip package with transportation, as a direct route from the station could make it easier for guests with lots of luggage or elderly travelers to visit?
Kimberly responded with a hint of interest, saying, "Oh, I hadn't thought of that. That's an interesting approach."
She's always smiling, but I've heard whispers about the financial struggles the inn is facing. As just the driver, I wasn't sure if it was my place to speak up, but I wanted to do something, no matter how small, to help this place. Actually, running a service like that would require both staff and money, so it's not that simple. Still, I'm grateful for the new ideas. With a warm smile, she added, "For now, I'll see if I can find some time to run the numbers." As the afternoon sun streamed into the courtyard, I was busy inspecting the tires on the inn's van. I felt someone quietly slip around to the back. Turning with an uneasy feeling, I saw, as expected, Stephen, the longtime staff member who also managed sales and planning, standing there. Stephen started as a front desk clerk at Clementine Inn and even earned a financial planner's certification to help improve the inn's operations. He was highly valued by Kimberly and the rest of the staff as a dependable figure, but for some reason, he always treated me with barely veiled disdain.
Well, you're actually maintaining the van seriously?
I mean, it's not like the driver's job matters if the car can't run.
But you're not thinking you can just sit around driving and still collect a paycheck, are you? His insinuating tone pricked at me. I resisted the urge to ask, "What do you mean by that?" and silently continued checking the tire pressure.
Then, as if he'd been waiting for this moment, Stephen shrugged and said smugly,
"This place is always short-staffed, you know? We need people to take the initiative and handle the odd jobs. The planning and sales team is running around nonstop, and even the in-attendants barely get a break. Meanwhile, you spend most of your time waiting around in the car, don't you? Admittedly, there are lulls in my schedule when I'm not shuttling guests.
Still, drivers have plenty of prep and checks to handle, but Stephen had no intention of understanding that. Looking around to confirm no one else was present, he leaned in and spoke more quietly.
Well, anyway, there's a mountain of stuff I'd love to dump on you since you're so free.
Here, get started on these." Before I could respond, he shoved a pile of dirty rags and cleaning supplies into my hands.
Tasks like mopping the hallways and organizing the cardboard boxes stacked in the storage room,
all jobs normally shared among cleaning staff or other employees, were suddenly mine to handle.
If you're so idle, earn your keep by helping out here. Show you're at least a little useful. And hey, I heard you've been giving Kimberly suggestions directly?
A mere driver thinking he can step up like that is hilarious.
Stick to what you're good at, which is driving. Just do what you're told and keep your mouth shut, okay? That's the only way you can prove your worth here.
Anger welled up inside me, but I didn't want to cause a scene, so I swallowed my pride and accepted the rags and cleaning supplies.
Understood.
As I murmured my acknowledgement, Stephen smirked, curling the corner of his mouth, and left with a parting shot, "Make sure you work hard." Even as the sound of his footsteps faded into the distance, an unpleasant weight lingered in my chest. Holding the cleaning supplies, I glanced over at the van. No matter how much I'm looked down on, I take pride in my work. I resolved that one day, I would show just how vital a driver could be to this inn, not through words, but through my actions. A few days later, I saw Kimberly walking down the hallway, looking exhausted. I had just returned from an early morning shuttle run and was organizing the luggage when I noticed her. Kimberly, always cheerful and full of energy, seemed drained, and the sight unsettled me.
She noticed me as well and offered a faint smile. "Thank you for your hard work. It must be tough, being up so early. I'm sorry if I've been looking a bit down lately."
Her weak voice tugged at my heart. It seemed that recent bookings and revenue weren't going well, and to make matters worse, maintenance costs for the aging facility were piling up. I didn't know all the details, but I'd heard that Stephen, armed with his financial planner certification,
had been proposing various solutions to Kimberly. At the end of the day, an inn can't run without money.
I'd like to upgrade the facilities, but the funds are limited. Kimberly sighed as she lowered her gaze.
I was at a loss for words. Deep down, I wanted to do something to help,
but I wasn't sure how far I should get involved. Just then, light footsteps sounded behind me at the worst possible moment.
It was Stephen. "Kimberly, did you read the documents I gave you the other day?"
He strode over, as confident and condescending as ever, holding up what looked like some kind of contract. He had been proposing various financial strategies under the guise of improving the inn's cash flow, including leases, investments,
and other financial instruments. Though not all of his suggestions were inherently bad, I'd heard rumors that some of them were overly aggressive.
For example, you could use a sale-leaseback arrangement,
temporarily selling the inn's building to secure working capital. Kimberly, you seem concerned about giving up ownership of the property, but in the end, you can't move forward without increasing your cash flow, right? On the surface, his argument seemed logical, but my gut told me it was a dangerous move. Even if it provided temporary funds, giving up ownership of the inn's property was far too risky. Kimberly seemed to feel the same way, furrowing her brow in frustration. Even if we can temporarily ease the cash flow, I'm worried about what happens after. A place like ours, which has been protected for so long, isn't something I want to give up so easily. Despite Stephen's persistent proposals, Kimberly couldn't bring herself to make a decision. She is not the president of the inn but its innkeeper. She seemed to be caught in a painful dilemma between preserving tradition and adapting to the realities of changing times. The next morning, I mustered up the courage to speak to Kimberly before starting my shift. Kimberly, do you have a moment to talk? She quickly tidied up the busy reception desk in the morning before turning to face me. Her usual warm smile gave me just enough courage to speak up. I'm not sure how to say this, but what if we focused on attracting more foreign visitors? Lately, it seems like more international tourists are venturing to rural inns like ours to experience authentic Japanese culture. If we could promote Clementine into overseas audiences, it might bring in new customers. For a moment, Kimberly's eyes widened in surprise. She probably hadn't expected me to make such a suggestion. It wouldn't have been surprising if she had dismissed me, thinking, "What's a driver doing, sticking his nose in?" But she didn't. Her expression quickly softened, and she murmured, "Foreign guests, huh," smiling as if she had just discovered a new door. That might actually be a wonderful idea. I think the hot springs in the mountains would be incredibly appealing to international visitors. I've never really considered PR from that angle before. Thank you, Kyle. Her words warmed my heart. Using financial techniques like Stephen does might be one way to approach things. But I can't help feeling that relying solely on that would mean losing something important. I believed in the value of finding new possibilities that emphasized the inn's strengths. For the first time, I felt like I had found a reason for my place here. Interesting, an innkeeper, hot springs, and foreign guests. This could be something special. Kimberly held the simple promotional materials I had prepared and murmured softly. What I had created wasn't much. It was just a handwritten English explanation and a list of ideas for experiences that might appeal to international travelers. For example, activities like trying on kimono or enjoying traditional regional dishes around a Japanese hearth. It was a proposal to highlight the uniquely Japanese charm of this inn. I'm not great at English, so I'm not sure how much I can do, but having a clear vision like this really helps. I'm glad if it's even a little useful. There are free tools, like tourism websites and social media platforms, that can help promote the inn to foreign guests. You're amazing, Kyle. I can't believe a driver would know so much about this. Well, I was just curious and did a bit of research. It's surprising what you can find with a simple internet search. Kimberly chuckled softly and hugged the materials to her chest as if they were precious. Thank you. I'll make good use of this. Maybe I'll even start studying English little by little myself. At that moment, the idea was still just a seed. But having a clear direction, which was to attract international guests, seemed to give Kimberly the courage to take a step forward. More importantly, the brightness in her eyes had returned, and that alone made me happy. From that point on, Kimberly began actively sharing information about the inn with international audiences. Using the materials I had created, she made simple updates to the inn's website in English and increased English posts on social media. Additionally, she partnered with travel sites for international visitors and began setting up a system to promote experience plans and accept bookings. Wow! I can't believe we're getting such a quick response. Kimberly's joyful voice at the reception desk brought smiles to the faces of the inn attendants as well. Over the next few weeks, bookings from international guests steadily increased, and the inn's revenue began to grow little by little. Of course, not everything went smoothly. There were moments of confusion due to language and cultural differences, but Kimberly would bow deeply and say, "Thank you. I couldn't have taken this step without everyone's ideas." Still, I couldn't ignore the unsettling presence I occasionally felt watching me from the shadows. Yes, it was Stephen. He hadn't been confronting me as much lately, but I occasionally felt his presence, watching me intently from the shadows of the hallway. It was as if he were silently asking, "Why is that guy earning Kimberly's trust?" And then, an incident occurred that seemed to confirm Stephen's attitude. One evening, I went to the reception desk for some business and found Kimberly talking excitedly. Apparently, this month's revenue had significantly surpassed that of the same period last year, and the occupancy rate was steadily rising. The growth in international guests was particularly notable, with positive reviews and social media buzz driving strong bookings for the upcoming season. "Kyle, thank you so much. I thought attracting international guests would be difficult at first, but it's really worth trying. The feedback has been amazing, and the results have come faster than I expected." I feel a bit relieved. Just as Kimberly said this with a bright smile, the sound of footsteps behind us made me turn instinctively. It was Stephen. Dressed impeccably in his suit, exuding an air of sharp competence, his face was adorned with a sarcastic smile. "Wow. Kimberly, you seem pretty cheerful. Foreign guests, huh? But don't you think this might just be a temporary trend?" "Sure. More tourists are visiting Japan, but there's no guarantee it will last forever. Pinning your hopes on something so uncertain seems like a pretty risky move to me." Kimberly's brows furrowed slightly at his remark. Although Stephen's tone wasn't as overtly domineering as before, his underlying maliciousness hadn't changed one bit. My own heart stirred uneasily, but I worked to remain composed. No one can predict the future, but doing nothing is far worse. Risks come with opportunities, and if we handle them well, they can turn into great chances. Stephen let out a small, derisive laugh through his nose. You've got a lot to say for a mere driver. But fine, go ahead. It seems Kimberly trusts you. Still, I'll continue proposing practical methods. We can't rely on such half measures forever." He paused, deliberately straightening his posture and lowering his tone for effect. "Even if it seems like the inn's doing well now, the reality is that we still lack the large-scale funds needed for renovations. It's about time a decision was made. The investment plan I suggested should be seriously considered. With substantial capital, we could proceed with upgrades and expansions." Kimberly dropped her gaze, struggling for words. While it was true that attracting international guests had improved sales, it wasn't nearly enough to fully address the aging facilities. It was difficult to outright dismiss the idea of bringing in investments. But it feels like that would change the very essence of this inn. Well, you'll see in time. I'm a lot more reliable than just a driver." Stephen said this before turning on his heel and walking away. As she watched his retreating figure, Kimberly let out a small sigh. "I honestly don't know where to draw the line when it comes to investments. But I do know that I don't want to destroy the atmosphere and warmth that Clementine Inn has preserved for so long." Kimberly, who had been lowering her gaze, lifted her head slightly. Her eyes reflected the soft glow of the reception area bathed in the evening light, faintly shimmering with emotion. "But because you care, Kyle, I feel like I can keep going. At first, you were just the new driver we'd hired, but since meeting you, I feel like I've been able to take small steps forward." Her voice, though soft, carried not just vulnerability but also determination. She said, "Honestly, I was never good at management or handling finances, and the pressure of preserving this inn, which has been passed down through generations, felt overwhelming, especially when it came to anything international, which seemed so daunting. But when you suggested attracting foreign guests, it felt like you opened an invisible door for me, and though trying something new is scary. Your ideas and support gave me the courage to take that step, and little by little, I feel like I'm becoming stronger as an innkeeper." Her candid words stirred something deep in my chest. Kimberly herself was carrying immense struggles and conflicts, yet she was still moving forward, one step at a time.
"No, if anything, I haven't done much at all. I'm always causing trouble."
Before I could finish, Kimberly softly smiled and gently placed her hand on my arm. The warmth of her touch lit a small spark deep within my heart.
"You're too modest. If you hadn't been here, I think I'd still be stuck in my shell. Thank you for giving me the push to look forward."
Being thanked so directly like this left me momentarily speechless. Still, just knowing that my presence had been a reason for Kimberly to smile, even for a moment, made me feel like all my efforts were worth it.
One morning, after completing my usual inspection of the van, I headed to the reception desk. Kimberly greeted me with an excited expression and said, "Kyle, you're just in time. Listen to this, there's some amazing news."
This group, called the Global Tourism Project, is offering support to rural inns and accommodations, helping with overseas promotion and large-scale tourism routes.
And guess what? They've reached out to us. If this goes through,
it could mean movement on the scale of $10 million. $10 million. The number didn't even feel real, but it meant a massive opportunity had come to Clementine. I murmured, "That's amazing," and shared in Kimberly's excitement, but beside her, Stephen stood with his arms crossed,
his expression appearing somewhat conflicted. The details haven't been finalized yet, and formal negotiations are still ahead.
It might be wise not to get too carried away just yet. His tone was as sharp as ever. Still, it was understandable that Stephen furrowed his brow. When a massive sum like $10 million is involved, the conditions and responsibilities are bound to be equally weighty. How the inn staff, myself included, would respond to this was not a simple matter.
It wasn't something that could be easily decided.
Kimberly's eyes, however, sparkled with hope. She wanted to preserve the charm and tradition that Clementine had cultivated over the years, but at the same time,
she didn't want to miss the immense opportunity before her.
Caught between these two conflicting desires, it seemed that, for now, the feeling of wanting to seize this chance had won out. A few days later, the inn was abuzz with activity. Word came that the VIP leading the overseas project would be visiting much sooner than expected. Originally, a face-to-face meeting had been scheduled for the beginning of next month, but the timeline had suddenly been moved up. It's not unusual for international business people to act on impulse when they want to see something immediately, but even so,
the speed of this development showed their serious intent. This is a huge opportunity, just what we needed. The overseas VIP is coming here? Is it true about the $10 million deal? The staff around the inn were visibly unsettled. Even the normally composed veteran in attendance seemed uneasy. One of them muttered nervously, "Oh my. Important people in suits coming to such a rural inn? That's unheard of."
Kimberly, meanwhile, was swiftly organizing documents at the reception desk, issuing clear instructions to each staff member, preparing the VIP's room, cleaning the facility, and arranging the meal plans. It was only natural that everyone was more focused than usual. I was scheduled to handle transportation and pick up the VIP from the airport. However, I had been told that a dedicated team, including an interpreter, would already be accompanying them. This is going to be a major negotiation, so it's best to bring in professionals.
Besides, Kyle, you'll be busier than usual with guest transportation around the inn, right? Everyone's rushing around nervously. So I'd like you to focus on ensuring the regular operations go smoothly as well.
As Kimberly had predicted, when news of the VIP visit spread, domestic guests seemed to catch wind of something interesting happening and inquiries for reservations began to increase. As the driver, I had to put even more effort into managing my shifts and keeping everything on track.
Then came the day of the visit.
According to the schedule, The overseas VIP, Richard, was expected to arrive in the evening, while Lucas, the interpreter, was supposed to arrive earlier in the morning. If the interpreter could arrive ahead of Richard, he would have enough time to meet with Kimberly, finalize plans, and ensure the negotiations would proceed smoothly. However, as noon approached, there was still no sign of Lucas. Repeated calls and emails went unanswered. The staff, along with Kimberly, were visibly unsettled, with Kimberly pacing back and forth in the reception area. This is troubling. I really wanted to communicate with the interpreter beforehand to ensure everything for the negotiation. Kimberly's voice was tinged with anxiety. Not having an interpreter for such a crucial discussion was a serious problem. We needed someone to oversee the translated documents and simulate the negotiation flow to avoid any missteps. I, too, had hoped to collaborate with the interpreter beforehand to ensure we could highlight the IN's strengths effectively. But that was no longer an option. To make matters worse, Richard's arrival was drawing closer. What if the interpreter doesn't make it? The staff began whispering their concerns aloud. The entrance and lobby were already prepared to perfection. The in attendants, dressed in traditional kimono, stood ready to welcome the VIP. Kimberly, meanwhile, was frantically checking her phone, but there was still no word from the interpreter. Just then, a call came in notifying us that Richard's group was just about to arrive at the inn. They were on their way by car from the station, leaving no time to spare. Breaking the tense silence, Stephen shrugged theatrically before speaking. See? I told you this was a bad idea. Letting a mere driver's suggestion bring in foreign guests was reckless. So, what now? Without an interpreter, how do you plan to handle the negotiation? His voice was laced with mockery, and it stirred a discomfort deep within me. Kimberly, momentarily crestfallen, took a deep breath and lifted her head. We can't welcome the VIP like this. Without a proper interpreter, there's no way to proceed with such an important negotiation. It's unfortunate. But this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the inn was on the brink of collapsing due to an unexpected problem. The weight of that realization hung heavily over the reception area. I had no choice but to make a decision. Clenching my teeth, I stepped forward. Kimberly. I'll do it. I'll be the interpreter. The air froze for a moment. The staff turned to me, stunned, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. Kimberly's eyes widened as she stared at me. What? Kyle? But, it's so sudden. Kimberly was at a loss for words, and I responded as calmly as possible. It's true I can't do it like a professional. But letting the negotiation fall apart would be an even bigger problem. Beside me, Stephen, as usual, sneered mockingly. What? Are you serious? A driver acting as an interpreter? That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Are you trying to sabotage this negotiation? His words dripped with sarcasm, and Kimberly's expression darkened further. But I ignored him and spoke with conviction, my voice firm. Since the interpreter isn't coming, someone has to step up. I may not be perfect, but I'll do my best to minimize any mistakes and make sure the negotiation goes as smoothly as possible. Stephen scoffed and smirked. Fine. I'll enjoy watching you make a fool of yourself, he said, turning his back and disappearing into the back of the reception area. As we watched him leave, Kimberly and I both took a deep breath and headed toward the entrance. The sound of an engine grew louder from outside the wide-open doors. The VIPs had arrived. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the scene outside. The car door opened, and a tall, broad-shouldered Caucasian man stepped out. It was Richard. Behind him stood several individuals who appeared to be business partners. With the dazzling light as his backdrop, Richard exuded the unmistakable aura of a world-class investor. Welcome to Clementine Inn. Kimberly greeted him in English, her expression tense with nervousness. Standing beside her, I bowed, ready to step in if needed. Richard smiled warmly, removed his hat, and glanced around. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the warm welcome. After Kimberly and Richard exchanged a brief conversation, I prepared to step in as an interpreter and provide a more detailed introduction. However, Richard stared intently at my face, his brows suddenly furrowing as he focused on me. Wait. I feel like I've seen you before. Haven't we met somewhere? Kimberly and the staff all turned to me, their faces a mix of surprise and curiosity. Of course, there was no way I had ever met Richard directly. Caught off guard, I forced a vague smile and began to speak. Ah. I'm Kyle, the driver here. Perhaps you've just seen me somewhere before. When I was just about to say that, Richard's eyes widened as if a light had just gone off, and he clapped his hands together. No, I'm certain. You're Kyle from Oxford. We met at a seminar or party with the MBA students, didn't we? My heart skipped a beat. Oxford. MBA. I never imagined Richard would remember all that so clearly. The surrounding staff widened their eyes in surprise, murmuring, Oxford? MBA? Kimberly, in particular, froze with an expression that seemed to say, What does this mean? Why on earth are you working as a driver? You had a reputation as a marketing expert. Richard's blunt question struck without mercy. It felt as though the past I had kept hidden was suddenly laid bare, and I found myself at a loss for words. Kimberly, though visibly confused, looked at me and gave a small nod. Her gaze seemed to say, It's okay, you don't have to hide it, and it gave me the push I needed. Yes, it's true that I studied at Oxford and earned my MBA. But after various events, I returned to Japan and now work as a driver. As I said this, the murmurs around me grew louder. The familiar in attendance and staff couldn't hide their surprise and confusion, murmuring, Kyle has an MBA? Really? Richard, on the other hand, muttered, Unbelievable. Before bursting into hearty laughter. This is fantastic. If you're here, there's no problem at all. I wasn't worried about not having a proper interpreter. But I never imagined we'd also have a marketing professional on top of that. His words left me with lingering mixed feelings, and I replied, No, it's really not much. But I could see Richard's business partners nodding enthusiastically, clearly excited. If you have an MBA with a background in marketing, we'd love to hear your thoughts on the redevelopment and expansion plans for this inn. All eyes turned to me. To be honest, revealing my true background in front of the staff here was a bit embarrassing. More than that, I felt guilty for having kept it hidden from Kimberly. But as Richard said, if I truly wanted to help this place, there was no room for hesitation. I took a deep breath and lifted my head. Understood. If I can be of any help, I'd be happy to share what I've been thinking. And, of course, I'll do my best to act as the interpreter for today's negotiations. When I said this, Richard nodded firmly and said, Great. Lead the way, Kyle. I looked at Kimberly, and as she softly whispered, Let's go, I began guiding them from the entrance to the grand hall. Deep within my heart, I made a firm resolution. I won't run away anymore. I'll use everything I've learned to help Clementine in. The grand hall had been quickly transformed into a negotiation space. A long table had been set up, covered with facility brochures and simple English pamphlets. After guiding Richard and his group to their seats, Kimberly sat beside me, and the business discussions began immediately. Richard's partners started throwing out proposals. We are considering investing up to $10 million in this region. What does Clementine need most? I translated their question into Japanese and gave Kimberly an encouraging look. She responded, a bit nervously. We need to renovate the facilities and establish a better system for promoting ourselves to English-speaking audiences. I conveyed her response in English and prepared for the next exchange. Richard, his eyes alight with interest, then turned directly to me. Kyle, What are your specific ideas for preserving tradition while enhancing the inn's international appeal? This was the moment for me to prove my worth. With support from Kimberly and the staff, I laid out the ideas I had been developing. Strategies for international PR, leveraging social media, and strengthening multilingual support. Additionally, collaborating with the surrounding region to create integrated tourism routes. Using the marketing theories I'd learned at Oxford and the insights I'd gained from working here, I painted a vision that combined tradition with modern tools and global outreach. In the end, this inn's greatest value lies in its genuine warmth, its traditions, and its tranquility. The ideal approach is to preserve those qualities while enhancing them through modern tools and global expansion. Even as I translated my own words, I felt the passion behind them. I silently hoped that this feeling would reach Richard and his team. They listened intently, and eventually, Richard stood with a satisfied smile. Excellent. This is exactly the direction I had envisioned. Kyle, Kimberly, I'd like to finalize this with you. Richard extended his hand for a handshake, which Kimberly and I took simultaneously. For a brief moment, I saw tears glistening in Kimberly's eyes. Richard's partners spread out documents with broad smiles. Let's proceed with the $10 million investment proposal. Once we finalize the terms, we'd like to sign the contract. A collective sigh of relief, almost like a cheer, escaped the staff. Who could have imagined such a monumental deal being sealed in this small mountain inn? In truth, it still didn't feel entirely real to me. But there was no denying that a historic moment was unfolding right before my eyes. Congratulations, Kimberly. And Kyle, well done. Hearing those words, Kimberly couldn't hold back her emotions and let a single tear fall as she smiled. I exhaled deeply in relief. This might be it. This inn might finally come back to life. Hearing Kimberly's trembling voice, I nodded deeply. After a longer than expected meeting, Richard and his team were set to leave the inn by evening. To see them off, Kimberly, the staff, and I gathered at the entrance. The calm of the reception area was gradually returning, but my heart was still racing. It was a wonderful experience. I never imagined such passionate and resolute people could be found in a mountain inn like this. Richard said with satisfaction, and he lifted his hat slightly in a gesture of farewell. Beside him, his business partners bowed politely in the Japanese way, smiles on their faces. Kyle, one last thing I'd like to confirm. Would you consider becoming our advisor? I'm serious, not joking. I gave a wry smile, unsure of how to respond. Thank you. It's an honor to hear that. But I still have so much left to do here. I see, so it's a no for now. But there's no rush. We'll always be waiting for you, so feel free to contact us anytime. Either way, once this investment project officially begins, we'll have another opportunity to talk. And next time, I doubt we'll need an interpreter, haha. As I watched Richard laugh cheerfully, I felt some of the tension in my shoulders ease. As the staff around them called out, "Take care and thank you very much," Richard and his team climbed into their large vehicle and drove off down the mountain road, disappearing into the evening light. The area grew quiet once more. Kimberly, who had been on the verge of tears from the tension, finally let her shoulders relax and nearly collapsed on the spot. The attendants supported her, saying, "Good work, Kimberly," as a sense of relief and calm filled the lobby. Then several months passed. The inn was now brimming with renewed energy, thanks to its partnership with the international investor, Richard. Looking back on the tumultuous days since I had volunteered as an interpreter, it all felt like a dream. The atmosphere of the entrance had transformed. The counter now displayed information cards in English and Chinese, while a monitor played promotional videos targeting an international audience. Once known as a quiet mountain retreat, the inn had evolved into a world-renowned traditional inn, becoming a bridge connecting the local region to the world. One day, just after I finished dropping off guests from the station in the van and was heading back to the reception desk, I noticed something unusual. Sensing a heavy tension in the lobby, I stopped in my tracks and saw a man in a suit with a faint smile. It was Kenneth. He was accompanied by several individuals who appeared to be his subordinates. Kenneth? What are you doing here? I couldn't help but gasp. Kyle, who is this? Kimberly, visibly cautious, asked me. Well, I hesitated, unable to answer, and Kenneth stepped forward, his smirk widening into a mocking grin. Well, isn't this a cold welcome? Kyle, it's been a while. His voice was quiet, but the venomous sarcasm was unmistakable. Come on, aren't you going to greet an old colleague who came all this way to visit? Or is it inconvenient for me to be here? Ha, I understand. You wouldn't want your past failures to come to light, would you? Those words sent a rush of anger surging through me. Don't you dare. The words escaped in a strained voice, and I could feel the staff around us inhale sharply. Kenneth, clearly enjoying the reaction, shrugged nonchalantly. Quite bold compared to before. Especially for someone who's settled for being a driver. Well, no matter. It's nice to see you again. After all, I'll never forget the pathetic look on your face when I crushed the career you were trying so hard to build. Crushed. Kenneth spoke of the past as if it were a trophy of his victory. Memories I had tried to bury resurfaced vividly in my mind. When I had first returned to Japan after studying at Oxford, I had crafted a business plan centered on revitalizing a small rural hot spring town. The plan involved attracting international investors and collaborating with local businesses to rejuvenate the entire region. At the time, everyone had high hopes for its potential. Many people actively supported my plan. This included executives from major travel companies and the Japanese branch manager of an international hotel chain. Kyle, your ideas show great foresight. Let's work hard together, they had assured me, pledging their active cooperation. I worked tirelessly, forging deeper connections with these individuals as my project neared its final stages. And then Kenneth appeared, pretending to be an ally interested in regional revitalization. At first, he was courteous and professional. But soon, the people who had promised to help me began to act differently. Sorry, but our strategy has changed. We've decided to partner with a company called Mirror Holdings. I heard that Kenneth had boasted about the core aspects of the plan I had developed, such as the network of international investors and the business framework, pretending they were his own achievements and claiming I have greater funding and broader connections to win them over. Before I knew it, the relationships I had worked so hard to build had completely shifted under Kenneth's control. Why would you do something like this? I demanded, but Kenneth simply sneered. Your plan? Ha, it's not bad as an idea. But without the financial clout, you're just wasting everyone's time. In the end, big projects like this should be controlled by those with real power. At the time, I thought Kenneth had simply stolen my idea. But in reality, he was simultaneously orchestrating a plan to erase me from the business world entirely. Soon after, rumors began spreading that I was involved in fraudulent business practices, causing my former collaborators and investors to distance themselves all at once. I don't know if it's true, but we can't afford to take risks, they said, one by one withdrawing their support. To make matters worse, Kenneth feigned sympathy while saying, no one wants to work with someone constantly surrounded by rumors, planting decisive distrust among companies and investors. In the end, the network I had built and the foundation of my project all fell into his hands, leaving me with neither credibility nor work. Kenneth then used the exact same project plan and international investment connections I had developed, presenting them as his company's vision, and quickly pushed forward with a large-scale resort development. Meanwhile, I was constantly haunted by rumors of fraudulent practices and found it impossible to regain trust wherever I went. Finally, Kenneth delivered his last words with a cold, merciless gaze. Too bad, Kyle. Thanks to your efforts, I didn't have to lift a finger to gather the best resources.
In the end, you lost your place entirely. Those words made me tremble with anger, yet there was nothing I could do.
And now, Kenneth had appeared before me once again.
The vivid pain of the past came rushing back.
The mocking laughter from that day.
The despair from that day.
Never again would I make the same mistake.
I swore it from the depths of my heart.
What exactly do you want here? When Kimberly quietly asked, Kenneth smirked. To put it simply, I'm here to take over this land and building.
I plan to launch a major development project. So I'll need the Clementine to cooperate, or better yet, vacate the premises entirely.
Gasps spread among the staff gathered in the reception area and lobby.
Kimberly bit her lips slightly, glaring at Kenneth.
Vacate? Don't be ridiculous. This is a place we've cherished and protected for generations. No matter how grand your plans are, we have no intention of being driven out.
Her voice trembled, but it carried undeniable resolve. Kenneth snorted and stepped closer to Kimberly, lowering his voice to a whisper.
My, can you really afford to act so defiant? But you know, Kimberly, I actually like you.
You seem capable, and you don't look half bad either.
If the Clementine disappears, you could always come work at my new hotel. Better yet, how about becoming my personal assistant?
Since you'll likely lose your place here, I wouldn't mind lending you a hand.
Kimberly instinctively stepped back, bumping into me.
Kenneth's words, though coated in feigned nonchalance, dripped with condescension and dominance. A surge of anger ignited deep within me.
Don't you dare, Kenneth.
This place means everything to us, to Kimberly and the staff.
I won't let you do as you please.
Kenneth's gaze turned sharp for a moment, pinning me in place. The tension in the air was palpable, and the staff around us held their breath. But then, with a smirk, Kenneth turned on his heel.
Fine. Shout all you want.
But don't expect that confidence to last. I'll make sure this place gets bought out sooner or later.
It won't be long before you come begging.
Glancing back at Kimberly with a sly smile, Kenneth said, My offer still stands.
I hope you make a wise decision. If you decide to come work for me,
perhaps I'll consider leaving this place intact, before leisurely leaving the inn with his subordinates.
Even after the door closed, the cold echo of his laughter seemed to linger, leaving the staff visibly shaken. Kimberly, realizing she had been holding her breath, took a small, deep inhale and quietly looked down.
I placed a hand gently on her shoulder, trying to reassure her that everything would be okay.
No matter what Kenneth tried, we would protect this inn. There was no room for doubt in that determination. That night,
I stepped outside, trying to calm the unease lingering in my chest. Just then, a lethargic voice called out from behind me.
Pathetic, aren't you, Kyle? It was Stephen.
Usually content with sly remarks from a distance, tonight his words were sharper than ever.
In the end, this place is going to crumble because of you, isn't it?
You made a big show of things.
But you'll just end up being swallowed whole by the rich guys, won't you?
I found myself at a loss for words.
Maybe it really is my fault. Hearing those weak words, Stephen scoffed in disbelief. Yeah, exactly. Guess I shouldn't have bothered trying to help with that interpreter thing in the first place. What do you mean by that?
When I instinctively questioned him, Stephen exaggeratedly shrugged his shoulders.
It's exactly as I said.
I made sure the interpreter couldn't come, so your meeting with the overseas VIP would fall apart.
I just told them. We've got enough staff, that's all. I gasped at his words. Why would he do something like that? But you overcame it and sealed the deal, didn't you? Even without an interpreter for the overseas VIP, you managed to handle it yourself, didn't you? So, this time will probably be no different. You'll figure something out, won't you? Conflicted, I responded with frustration.
You tried to sabotage the deal at first, so why are you saying this now?
Stephen twisted his mouth slightly and, looking down for a moment, replied, "Well, I'll admit it that I couldn't stand you at first. A mere driver stepping out of line. Acting all high and mighty with your project proposals and even handling interpretation. You were stealing the spotlight, and it pissed me off. Your way of doing things clashed with mine, and I found it irritating. But then, you went and took on that interpreting job yourself, landing a major deal. I had to admit, I respected you a little for that. To be honest, I was jealous. And I realized you were on a completely different level." Stephen's face showed a mix of emotions. But for a brief moment, his eyes looked straight at me. "About that interpreting thing. I'm really sorry. I don't have any right to ask you for anything, but I want you to help save this in. Kimberly trusts you, after all. I'll do whatever I can to support you. Please." His words stirred a faint warmth in my chest. Though his tone was rough, it was clear he was encouraging me in his own way, believing that I still had it in me to make a difference. There was something only I could do. And he was right. If I didn't step up now, we had no chance against Kenneth. I let out a small breath, shaking off the weight of my doubts, and resolved deep within myself. If I ran away here, I'd never be able to reclaim who I truly was. A few days later, as the sun began to set, Kenneth reappeared at the front entrance of the inn. Behind him stood a group of burly men who looked like his subordinates. This time, his presence was more intimidating than ever, as if he had come to deliver the final blow. "Hey, Kyle. Are you ready?" Kenneth strode into the lobby, looking down at me with an icy sneer. "Or maybe you prefer to hand Kimberly over and beg for mercy? Ha! She's quite the impressive innkeeper. I'd happily hire her as my personal secretary. Not a bad deal, wouldn't you agree?" Kimberly's shoulder trembled faintly as she stood beside me. I stepped forward to shield her and steadied my voice as I addressed Kenneth. "Sorry, but your demands won't be met. This place is precious to us. There's no way we'll hand Kimberly over or let you take it without a fight." Kenneth snorted in disbelief, letting out a dismissive "huh?" "Even now, you're still putting up a front. No matter how much you struggle, you can't stop my plan." At that moment, Kenneth's phone buzzed softly, signaling an incoming call. What now, of all times? He grumbled in irritation, glancing at the screen. However, the instant he saw the name displayed, his expression abruptly shifted. It seemed to be someone he absolutely couldn't defy. "Kenneth, back off." The sharp command was curt and final, causing Kenneth's lips to tremble involuntarily. "What? Back off?" "That's right. We've decided to appoint Kyle as our advisor." Kenneth's eyes widened in disbelief as he gripped his phone tighter. "What? Kyle is a talent even Richard wanted. I heard he was frustrated to have been turned down. How could we let such a person slip through our fingers? But Kyle is..." "Silence, Kenneth. You lied to me, didn't you? You told me Kyle was a dangerous man, involved in shady dealings. But it turns out all of it was baseless lies. Manipulating people and monopolizing the region? Your methods are unacceptable. You're fired, Kenneth. From now on, you're barred from any dealings with me. Understand this, you are no longer needed. Leave." With that, the call ended abruptly, leaving the distinct tone of a disconnected line lingering in the air. The monotonous tone of the disconnected call echoed across the spacious lobby, and Kenneth stood frozen, staring blankly at his phone. His subordinates exchanged uneasy glances, their spirits visibly deflated. "They're cutting me off, this can't be, why?" Kenneth muttered weakly, barely lifting his face, and glared at me as if grasping for something to cling to. But no threats came from him anymore. The intimidating aura Kenneth once exuded was entirely gone, leaving behind nothing but a defeated man. "Now you see, Kenneth. No matter how much scheming you do behind the scenes, the truth always comes to light. I won't let you crush me again. And I won't allow you to trample over Clementine in either. My words resonated quietly throughout the lobby. Kenneth clenched his fists tightly, his expression twisting with bitterness as he glared at me. After a long, tense pause, he finally let out a low, guttural sound and spoke. When did you realize that I wasn't just acting on my own? In response to his question, I briefly glanced around. Feeling Kimberly and the staff holding their breath as they watched, I quietly began to speak. When did I realize it? Well, rather than a specific moment, it was Stephen who gave me a hint. He said, "Isn't there something only you can do?" He may be rough around the edges, but he had a sharp eye. Stephen noticed there were too many oddities about why someone like you, Kenneth, would target such a small hot spring in. Together, we dug deep into your company's background. And, surprisingly enough, we discovered that Mirror Holdings is just the public front for this plan. Behind it lies a much larger entity. Stephen and I first decided to trace the timeline of major development projects Mirror Holdings had been involved in. We discovered a common pattern: each project showed significant inflows of foreign capital. Even the smaller ventures were backed by an unusually abundant amount of funding. It was clear that this scale was beyond what Kenneth could handle alone. And as we dug deeper, one name surfaced: William. He's the founder of a global investment fund and a major international financier, isn't he? It turns out that the one plotting to acquire this place and the surrounding area was William. At the mention of that name, Kenneth's expression stiffened even more. His visible agitation was impossible to miss. I never intended to resort to such tactics at first. But I had to protect the company. Mirror Holdings may look big, but in reality, it's a fragile enterprise that can't survive without William's funding. If the major investments were pulled, it would collapse in no time. That's why I had to produce results quickly, to earn his favor. Kenneth hung his head, his words trickling out as if recalling them piece by piece. When we were students, as a fellow Japanese, I was genuinely impressed by your capabilities. Back then, no matter how difficult the challenge, you solved it as if it were nothing, and everyone around you admired you. Honestly, I envied you. Admitting it as jealousy was humiliating. But at some point, I started thinking, if I can't be like him, I'll just take what he has. His voice carried a self-deprecating chuckle. Yes, Kenneth was also an exceptional student who had graduated from Oxford. As a former classmate, there was likely a time when Kenneth acknowledged and respected me. However, that admiration had taken a distorted path. Looking back now, it was short-sighted. I thought if I could fully harness your abilities and knowledge, my business would flourish instantly. But I was always consumed with figuring out how to keep my company afloat, never having a moment to breathe. Above me was William. And without his investments, my Mirror Holdings wouldn't survive. If I fell out of his favor, he'd withdraw his funding, and that would be the end. That's why I couldn't afford to be selective in my methods. The final words trembled in his voice. Kenneth lowered his gaze to the dimly lit lobby floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. His shoulders rose and fell slightly, as if he had poured out everything inside him. But even so, setting someone up to fail was wrong. Don't you think? The unexpected remark came from Kimberly. I understand you had to protect your company. I'm sure that must have been incredibly difficult. But that doesn't justify stealing the fruits of someone else's hard work. Deep down, you know better than anyone that it was an irreparable mistake. Kenneth listened intently, his tense expression gradually softening as he exhaled briefly. He awkwardly averted his gaze, then turned abruptly, walking toward the entrance as if fleeing from himself. Dragging the heavy air of the lobby with him, Kenneth placed a hand on the door, glancing back slightly to gesture at his subordinates. You're incredible, after all. Your talent, which I admired back in our student days, hasn't faded, and it's only grown sharper. To think you've secured a consultancy contract instead of just being used by someone like William. That's something I could never have achieved." Kenneth murmured these words, his expression a mixture of regret, frustration, and a faint glimmer of resignation. Before stepping out into the evening light. "No, you were incredible in your own way. There was even a time when I thought I could never beat you, no matter how hard I tried. You just made the wrong choice when you were pushed to the edge. But if that reckless determination of yours had been directed differently, I think things could have turned out much better for you." Hearing those unexpected words, Kenneth's eyes seemed to glisten ever so slightly. "Ha! It doesn't mean much to be praised by you now. But just being able to exchange these words with you in the end makes me feel a little less lost. Thank you, Kyle. I may never be able to come back from this, but you keep moving forward as yourself. And if our paths ever cross again, I'd like to stand on equal ground with you." Kenneth's final words were laced with genuine sincerity. Though we had once harbored resentment for each other, an unspoken respect now lingered between us. "Yeah. If we meet again someday, I hope it's in a different way. And next time, I want to see you standing tall on your own. Not in someone else's shadow like Wiseman's." Kenneth tightened his lips, turned his face away brusquely, and this time, pushed the lobby doors open with a firm motion. Behind him, his subordinates followed hesitantly, casting uneasy glances around. As the door began to close, Kenneth gave a small wave in farewell before disappearing into the light beyond. "Kyle." Kimberly's voice trembled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears as she struggled to contain the surge of emotions welling within her. "It's all right now. Including the matter with William, we'll protect this inn from now on. Together, we'll make this place even more appealing." Kimberly nodded deeply, and the staff gathered in the lobby gradually relaxed, their faces breaking into relieved smiles. The soft remnants of the evening sun filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow over the reception area. Then several months passed. Rumors began to circulate that Kenneth had downsized Mirror Holdings and was working steadily to rebuild the company. Though he could no longer boast as boldly as before. He seemed to have abandoned his underhanded tactics and was maintaining the business through honest means. Through mutual acquaintances, I learned that Kenneth had muttered something about wanting to challenge me again someday. It seemed Kenneth had resolved to make a fresh start. If he could demonstrate his true capabilities without using others as stepping stones, there might come a day when we could face each other in a fair competition. Meanwhile, with Kenneth's interference gone, Clementine Inn was attracting even more international guests. Leveraging Richard's investment network, they expanded plans for inbound tourists and strengthened their overseas PR efforts through social media. Before we knew it, the inn's rooms were consistently over 80% booked on weekdays, and on weekends, it was rare to find a vacancy. When Richard learned about my contract with William, he protested, saying, "It's not fair that only William gets you. You've got to sign with me too. Or it won't be equal." And as a result, I ended up securing advisory contracts with two of the world's most prominent investors, William and Richard. These two seemed to share a curious relationship, being deeply rooted rivals yet occasionally finding ways to cooperate. However, through this incident, William himself realized that most of Kenneth's reports were filled with misunderstandings and misinformation, which led him to abandon any unnecessary hostility toward me. Rather, he even approached me, saying, "I'd like to hear your thoughts at length sometime," which led to several three-way meetings with Richard also present. As a result, William seemed to realize that nurturing investments with a long-term perspective, rather than simply profiting by crushing local areas, would yield greater benefits. And he began demonstrating a willingness to collaborate with residents and business owners in several regional projects. Richard also showed understanding, saying, "I like it. It's constructive thinking," creating moments where the two seemed less like rivals and more like allies brainstorming global opportunities. However, even these two great figures have surprisingly childish sides. Before long, they started keeping an eye on each other's moves or competing in subtle ways, making my role as a mediator quite demanding. Richard's sulking, you know. He's complaining that you're only talking to William. And William, on the other hand, would grumble, Richard loves the spotlight, so we can't let our guard down with him. As a result, my phone rings incessantly throughout the day. Seriously, there's no time for chauffeur duties anymore. As I was organizing documents at the inn's reception desk, Stephen teased me with a smirk. Of course not. You're juggling the schedules of the world's two biggest investors, right? When are you ever going to drive again? I barely do it anymore. I'd like to give guests a ride now and then, but these days, I'm swamped with advisory and translation work. I muttered with a wry smile, and Stephen responded with a sly chuckle. But you know, Kyle, whenever you're not around the inn, Kimberly seems pretty lonely. She tries to hide it, though. Stephen whispered such a comment in my ear, causing my face to involuntarily flush red. Is that so? Well, I do want to put down stronger roots here. But dealing with all the back and forth between William and Richard leaves me no time. I muttered, only for Stephen, standing by the front desk, to shrug dramatically and jump at the chance to comment. Oh, is that right? Well, if you're so busy, then I guess it's up to me to claim Kimberly for myself. For a moment, I couldn't process what he'd just said, and my eyes widened in shock. What? You can't say things like that. That's not funny. When I hurriedly responded, Stephen grinned mischievously, the corners of his mouth curling upward as if he was thoroughly enjoying himself. Whether it's a joke or not depends on how you handle things. Kimberly has her own choice to make too, you know. At that very moment, I caught sight of Kimberly, standing by the front desk, organizing papers. Her shoulders trembled slightly as her face turned bright red, and she avoided looking in my direction. It was clear she'd overheard every word. Embarrassed, she clutched the papers in her hands, keeping her gaze averted. Meanwhile, Stephen whistled nonchalantly as he returned to his work, as if to emphasize the deliberate nature of his comment. Even though I knew he'd said it on purpose, I couldn't help but feel the warmth spreading to my cheeks. Really, this is too much. I muttered softly and glanced toward Kimberly. She briefly met my gaze, her cheeks flushed as she smiled shyly. The other staff members around us were grinning knowingly. Stephen's careless comment was embarrassingly bold, but in some way, it felt like it gave me a little push, warming something deep in my chest. Even the rivalry between William and Richard, arguing over he's my advisor, now seemed like an endearing comedy. Stephen's teasing and the playful jabs from the inn staff, every bit of it felt precious to me. Tomorrow, new guests from across the sea are set to arrive. When Kimberly and I exchanged a glance, we nodded to each other with determination, saying, "All right, let's do our best," to motivate each other. The inn continued to prepare for the next morning as the night deepened. In this way, transitioning from a driver to an advisor, I continue to support this place. And I am certain that this will always be the place I call home. No matter how far the world expands, the place I always return to is here. The warm and welcoming Clementine Inn, lovingly protected by Kimberly and the others.